As with all of our Ford Evening Book Talks, I want to thank the generosity of the Ford Motor Company, without whom these types of events would not be possible, because they allow us to bring in scholars to support their scholarship and to make them free to all of you. For tonight's screen, if you haven't used this type of QR program, this is a way that we can incorporate the audience into our program tonight to make you all included in a part of our conversation. If you have not used it, you pull up your camera app on your phone and you hover it over the QR code, and it will automatically take you. You then click on the little link and it will take you to a website where you can enter your questions. You can do so at any time throughout the program, and then I will get them all in a queue on the handy dandy laptop when it's time for that part of the program. And that way we can talk about what you want to know more about. So it's a great way to include the audience. If you are planning your next visit to the library, a couple of programs I'd like to draw your attention to. On November 7th and 8th, which is going to be here before we know it, we will be hosting the 2025 George Washington Symposium, which we do host every year. This year's theme is the American Military at 250, and we are really excited to have experts from a number of different fields and across the spectrum of public history, policy, and the military to talk about the founding of the American military all the way up to where it is today. Our next Ford Evening Book Talk will be November 12th with Jeffrey Rosen on his new book, The Pursuit of Liberty: How Hamilton versus Jefferson Ignited the Lasting Battle Over Power in America. And on November 18th, our monthly Lunch at the Library series will be with Gunston Hall's senior curator and head of collections, Kate Steyer, who has recently discovered a letter between George Mason and George Washington that was unknown until they found it in their collections. It was not in the George Washington Papers Project. And so, obviously, those types of discoveries are ones that we all want to have all the time, but they're actually fairly rare. And so we are so thrilled that they're going to bring the letter and talk to us about it and share it with our audience. It is now my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker tonight, who I will be in conversation with. Kate Haulman researches and teaches the history of early America, women's and gender history, and public history. She is the author of The Politics of Fashion in 18th-Century America, which was the winner of the Berkshire Conference Prize for Best First Book in the History of Women, and co-editor with Pamela Nadell of Making Women's Histories Beyond National Perspectives. She also co-curated the exhibit All Work, No Pay, A History of Women's Invisible Labor in the Home at the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History. And she is here tonight to talk about her latest book, which she worked on when she was a fellow here, titled The Mother of Washington in 19th-Century America. Please join me in welcoming Kate Haulman.
Thank you for that lovely introduction.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you so much for being here. It's a thrill to have you.
Pleasure to be back.
The screen is really hot. So if at any point you see us like fanning ourselves, that's why.
Shooting forward.
You know, we don't want to fall off the stage, but we're giving you a behind the scenes experience. So I think maybe a good place to start, because actually your book is more about what happens after Mary Ball Washington was alive. So could you talk a little bit about her life, maybe just give us a little biographical sketch so we can set the stage for what comes next?
Sure, in a nutshell.
Yes,
She
whole life in like 2 minutes.
I'm just thinking, long and eventful life. Mary Ball, she was born Mary Ball in the first decade of the 18th century, not too far from here, the northern neck of Virginia, to the Ball family, an affluent, prominent family of the area, although not among the Virginia oligarchy, the Carters, for example, Birds. And she was born to privilege, but she had a lot of upheavals in her life too. And they started at a pretty young age. Her father died when she was very young. And in a way that captures both, I think, the disruptions of her life, but also the privilege, he bequeathed to her property in people, enslaved people, and land. So she became a kind of an enslaver in some ways at a very young age. Then her mother remarried pretty quickly, which would not have been unusual at the time. Her stepfather then died. Then her mother died. And so she was basically raised in some very formative years of her life by a half-sister and with family friends in ways that would have been very typical of her class or station in 18th century Virginia gentlewoman. She married Augustine Washington, the father of Washington, in her early 20s, and they set up house on a piece of property that would be later known as Ferry Farm, outskirts of Fredericksburg, Spotsylvania County, and began having children, the first of which, George Washington. I should say also she became a stepmother when she married Augustine because he had two sons from a former marriage. She, again, lived a long life. Augustine died, the war death, when George was 11, so she was in her mid-30s, and she never remarried. So she chose to remain a widow, to remain unmarried, and I think to kind of safeguard some of her independence. And she did live a kind of dependent independence because she was very dependent on the labor, of course, of enslaved people, and George moved her to Fredericksburg in the 1770s so she could be near her daughter Betty and her husband Fielding, their family, what is now Kenmore, later became Kenmore Estate in Fredericksburg. And there she lived until she died in her early 80s of breast cancer. So it's a long, eventful life, very brief.
So I want to just pick at a couple of points of that before we start talking about, her death and what comes later. Was she explicit about why she didn't remarry? Did she talk about that, or are we kind of surmising?
That's a great question. No, we don't have a lot of her words, in part. So, we have some of her words, some of her letters to Washington, but really, there's no diary, there's no, kind of confessional anything. So no, some of that is just my sense of, so there's some stories about her, some traits that make her seem like she just wanted to retain some power and control over her life, her property, and maybe to kind of safeguard her children's inheritance that might have been in jeopardy if she had chosen to remarry. So there's some different ways of interpreting that decision.
What was the response when she, we're going to talk about a sort of lengthy period of time and how legacy and memory changes and evolves over time, but what was the initial response to her death?
Well, I mean, not much in a public sense, that you might expect that when the mother of Washington, but that is a figure that, as I'm going to talk about, has to be sort of created. There's a public or official mourning for a time that Washington and political society goes into, as would have been the tradition in the 18th century, a dark armband, mourning dress. There's an obituary for her. We think there was a funeral. We don't have any direct records of that. We believe that she's buried on the grounds of Kenmore. Unmarked, but might have been marked at one time, was later unmarked. So we don't really there isn't a big public memory of Mary Washington right after her death, as you might expect. But a lot of these things are creations of the 19th century, as is true of a lot of early American history.
Absolutely. Okay, one more before we get to the 19th century. How did her children respond to her death?
Well, I think Betty was bereft, was heartbroken, and they were very close. And although Mary never went to live with her, and again, she, I think, wanted to live on her own. To get back to your previous question, and George had already assumed the presidency in Philadelphia, and so he was mournful, of course, and wrote a letter about how this is a sad thing, but we don't want to linger on it too much because she did live a very long life, and so it's not his pose and his words are not replete with deep emotion, but we wouldn't expect that anyway. So I think that there were different responses to her death.
That's true.
Burgess Ball wrote him and said, the old lady, called her the old lady.
Yes, he didn't do a whole lot of personal emotion, certainly not in the presidency, sharing those kinds of things. Right. So that does make sense. Okay, so you mentioned this concept of the mother of Washington. Where does that come from? Who creates it? How is it created?
Yes, I mean, that's really at the heart of the book. And it really is I say that maybe we see some glimmers of it in the obituary. right? Her obituary. It's not a long obituary, and it's really almost more about George than her, but she was virtuous. Mason Locke Weems in Life of Washington, I think the sixth edition, she starts appearing in there, and we get some picture, a bit of a depiction um, of a loving mother, but not much. It's really in 1826 with George Washington Parke Custis, so George and George's sort of adopted son, and he writes the essay from which the figure and the title of the book is taken, The Mother of Washington. And it's this biographical sketch. It appears in two parts in the National Examiner in Philadelphia. Oh no, the National Gazette. And this is a moment, 1826, and we were about to come up on a big anniversary. That is the 50th, right? First anniversary in commemoration of the United States. And so Parke Custis, who has already fashioned himself as the tender of the Washington legacy and the kind of holder of all things Washington, literally stuff. He really wants to draw attention to, again, all things Washington and to her memory, and that she needs to be memorialized in some way. So we get this depiction, this figure, for the first time through the pen of Parke Custis in 1826. And so the Mother of Washington is born in death.
Yeah, so I want to dig into a little bit that moment, 1826. So it's interesting because, he doesn't write an essay about Washington. He writes about Washington's mother. So what about that moment was important to bring her to the front of the story? And maybe as part of that, you could tell us a little bit about what the nation is going through and why this, other than the fact that it was 50th, why this would be a compelling message.
I mean, all of Parke Custis's stuff is also about Washington, right? So that's important to him to make. He's a hero in his eyes, and to make him shine too in these stories about the Mother of Washington. But in addition to the 50th, it's a moment where a certain vision and version of motherhood is really starting to become very important and congeal. And that's because, in part, you have women starting to move into the public sphere through things like the removal debates. That's both Cherokee women and white women who become involved. And so one of the things that the Mother of Washington kind of comes to signify at different moments in the 19th century is a more traditional version of womanhood and motherhood as purely domestic, private, deeply pious, Christian, but as a counterpoint to the Christian women of anti-slavery and abolition mobilizing. So she's really made into this figure that serves as a kind of counterpoint to other women who are also sort of claiming the right to advocate, to speak, to be in public, to engage the state on the grounds of their motherhood, in part. Like, we are mothers of the Republic, we are women, we are mothers of the Republic. And so, this is not anything Parke Custis says expressly, but it's an interesting moment for the fashioning of this figure.
I wanted to dig into that a little bit, which is, so I think what I heard you say was that there was a certain type of Christianity that was especially popular in sort of pro-abolition circles. That was a much more politicized version, a much more public version that he was contrasting. Is that right?
I would say that. I would say that women who are signing, anti-slavery petitions. I'm thinking about some of these movements in Virginia before the Turner Revolt, for example. That yes, they are claiming that we are, as good Christians, we are anti-slavery. Slavery is a blight on the nation. It is immoral. It is unchristian, and we, as Christian mothers of the Republic, oppose it. So that, there is that kind of Christian motherhood grounding. And I think you see that across time with, various groups mobilizing and using Christianity as a way of legitimating their actions.
So was his argument about this particular type of motherhood and her as an example Was that did it immediately catch fire, or did it take time to kind of build up and get popular?
Well, I think that in a way, this version of her, this Mother of Washington figure, partakes of some, trends in thinking, cultural trends in motherhood that are already afoot, and then reinforces them and links them to the founding past, right? Lodges them in the figure of the Mother of Washington, and also by association, Washington. So I think that makes a lot of sense.
So how did that continue to evolve over the 19th century? And did it shift? Did interpretations or portrayals of her shift? How did that go?
Well, I mean, the Mother Washington figure, once she's on the scene, she's very, very much on the scene for the antebellum period. And biographies both of George and then the first biography of Mary, which is joint with Martha, which is kind of interesting. She's the other Washington woman who gets a lot of attention. That the figure, and especially the Christian piece, the pious piece, really starts to flourish. And the figure becomes more developed in some ways. And the other thing that Custis does in that original essay is create, you see a little bit of this in Weems, but kind of a canon of stories about her that is with us to this day. And so then other authors pick up, repeat those stories, elaborate them, try to find different documentary evidence for different pieces, different kinds of those stories, and they're pretty indelible.
I'm going to ask you to share your favorite of those stories, but did he, or a couple, whatever, it's very mean to ask a historian to pick a favorite of anything. Favorite book, favorite piece of evidence, it's an impossible question. So share however many you would like, but did he, like Weems, did he make them up, or did he actually have some?
I mean, it's a mix, right? I mean,
Yes, tell us some of the stories.
So for Custis, he had some proximity. Now, he would have been very young, so it would have been difficult for him to really remember her in person, but he has more as told to things in that. There's one moment where he says, Lawrence of Chotank shared with me that I was 10 times more afraid of her than I was of my own parents, or something like that. So, that she was in some ways a stern and fearsome figure. And Custis also uses Spartan mother, Spartan parenting throughout this piece. Wait, where is it going? Oh, favorite stories.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, so, and then at where he gets them. So, okay, there's one that we do have some documentary evidence for, which I call the British Navy episode. And it's well known by people who know about anything about George Washington, too, that he, as a young person, not even quite a young teen, wanted to join the British Navy, had his heart set on doing so, and that she didn't want him to, and ultimately kind of prevented him from doing that. And that is actually not in part Custis, but that's in Weems. Mm-hmm. So but that makes it into almost every other biography of her, biography of George. One of my favorite stories from the Mother of Washington essay that does get, again, repeated is what I call the sorrel colt tale. And this is important because, well, I'll share the story with you, but it's the thing that comes to replace the Weems cherry tree tale as the source of George's famed, reputed honesty. And in this story, Mary, a known and noted horsewoman, like her son, had a favorite horse, a blooded colt, sorrel colt. And one morning, George and some of his friends, we don't have any evidence for this, were out playing, and he decided that he was going to try to break what had been known to be an ungovernable horse. And he decided he was going to try this, and in the attempt, in the doing so, the horse died beneath him. Okay, so he's killed the horse, sort of. So I don't think this is true, but I know. So he, in this story, goes back into the house for breakfast or whatever, and it's almost as if she knows. She sort of says, have you seen my favorite? He's been out and about. Have you seen? And he says, Madam, your favorite is dead. And it's this moment where he's just so direct with her, and she, very composed, but sort of flushes with, emotion, anger, whatever, for a moment. and then says, well, I am deeply saddened by the loss of my favorite, but I rejoice in my son, who always tells the truth.
Okay.
He could have lied. He could have said, hadn't seen him, hadn't seen the horse. Who knows, Mom? But
That actually makes the Cherry story sound pretty credible. That is a good one. Okay, so how does I'm curious when, one of the big sort of topics when one is discussing Mary Ball over the last couple of decades is this pushback on the idea that she was this shrew, that she was constantly asking George for things, that she was harassing him, that she was difficult, that she was, so where does that come from? How is that introduced?
I'll tell you, it doesn't come from the 19th century. Really, this is where interpretation becomes important, right, for historians, because in the 19th century, some of the same stories, some of the same pieces of evidence, the British Navy episode, for example, just to take one where we have some documentary evidence, that's read as loving care, knowing what's best for him, also her wishes being in line with providence. He was being saved for something greater. She had a sense of this, right? So that's the 19th century's read of that, and of her, that she's the mother of question, mother par excellence, like no better, right? Now, you do see some glimpses in there of the stern figure, of the Spartan figure, but that is these are 20th century George's biographers' reads of her. And there's really, and this is from the Martha Saxton excellent biography of Mary Ball Washington, no evidence that she petitioned the Virginia Assembly wanting assistance or did things like this to embarrass him. She did feel some sense of precarity and need in her later life as she was aging, and the disruptions of the Revolutionary War. And I sometimes think he didn't have the greatest understanding for appreciation of that. I mean, he had a lot on his plate, of course, but yes, those things are, the portrayal of her in 19th century hands is completely the opposite of what we have seen, what we saw her in the 20th century.
Do you think that is a product of the people who are writing it? So it's no longer like these stories are no longer really in the Washington hands, and or is it a product of sort of our contested debates over motherhood shifting?
Both, I think so. I mean, because people are writing in their contexts,
Sure.
Right? And who's doing the writing? So, I mean, if you had more women writing about her maybe in the 20th century, of course you had men writing about her in the 19th century, but they had certain cultural commitments around motherhood that were very important for the 19th century, and that the 20th century is a different context. And so then you get in the past 20 years more of what I would call maybe a feminist recovery of Mary Ball Washington on her own terms, right? Attempts at that.
So we talked a lot about the sort of her role in defining and thinking about motherhood and women's roles in society, but it also gets at another really important element, which was true in 1826. It's going to be true in 2026, which is the role of memory in these stories in American history. How does this story help us sort of unpack the role of memory and how it shifts and shapes and who participates?
I mean, I think like any investigation of historical memory and its creation, that's part of it. Historical memory has to be created. It's created by certain people for certain reasons, and memories, I should say plural, because it's always contested, right? The memory of certain mothers, the memory of the Revolution is always contested and should be. And you see it with Mary across time. And you see it. There's the other. You're probably going to ask me about this at some point, but one of the things Park Custis wants, of course, is a memorial to her, a monument. And monuments are contested as well as we've seen lately. So it's just important to acknowledge that the things we have to ask is who is being remembered, when, why, by whom, for what purposes. Right, and whenever it comes to creating a historical memory or commemorating something, those are the things we want to pay attention to.
Such a good point. And I think this is where, especially in this moment where we've been having these conversations, it is really essential, I think, to separate the history, which is what I define as the, sort of the facts and the things that happened, from how we choose to remember them, because that's a very different conscious action. So I do want a perfect transition to the monument part of the story. There is an effort to memorialize her in a specific way, so a concrete set of actions to remember in a certain fashion. How does that unfold?
Well, over a long period of time and haltingly and with mixed success, for one thing. I mean, there is, you may know, a Mary Washington Monument stands today in Fredericksburg. It's an obelisk, but it got going in response, in part, to Parke Custis's essay in the early 1830s. And it was Custis and other men of Fredericksburg and members of the extended Washington family, like George Washington Bassett and Lawrence Lewis, who wanted to get this monument going. And there's an interesting kind of story that you can find in chapter 2 about the different claims to Mary and how she should be memorialized and by whom and where exactly. But a monument does get underway in 1833. Andrew Jackson comes down to lay the cornerstone. The ceremony is full of paeans to ideal motherhood, of which Mary was an example. And then it is only partially completed, and it stands partially finished, unfinished for more than 6 decades and kind of runs to ruin. The base is built, and they get as far as bringing the shaft that was to top it. I mean, there was going to be, in the original design, there's a bust of George at the top. So again, a lot about George. So then the monument itself has this fascinating, odd history as this unfinished structure and kind of ruin, romantic almost ruin, but people have different relationships to it.
And what does it look like today?
Well, it looks like a mini Washington Monument. It's just a smaller version. It's an obelisk, it's a smaller version of the Washington Monument.
This might be a stupid question, but I assume that was intentional.
Oh, 100%. Yes.
Okay.
I mean, by the time, so yeah, spoiler alert, it is finished. We know there's one there today. It's finished in the 1890s by 2 women's groups, one local to Fredericksburg and one national, located here, I was going to say here in DC, but across the river in DC. 2 Mary Washington Memorial Associations, and they work together, although not utterly, totally without conflict. But the decision for the obelisk is by the nationals, and they.
And it sounds like these 2 groups, participated later. But one of the most important questions one must always ask for a monument was who paid for it.
Who paid for it? Well, the national raised money.
Okay.
They raised money. Through their own membership dues and through fundraising gala events across the country. There were chapters of this organization everywhere, and that's where the real money came from. And it wasn't really probably enough, but they had enough to do the obelisk. And that's a story from the monument's inception. People thought or hoped that people would be really forthcoming with funds for this purpose, and they weren't. And one of the ways I read that is kind of, different moments, different things going on in terms of the economy locally or nationally. But in a way, a monument to a woman and to a mother is somewhat paradoxical, right? We think of monuments as to men, as to public figures, political figures. And so I think this just sat a little uneasy in maybe the collective consciousness.
So she's not the only woman that we remember from the 19th century or whose memory was used for particular purposes. Who are some of the other women that we think about, that we remember, and why?
Well, I mean, she's the first to get at least a partial monument. Hannah Dustan, who was a heroine of the King William's War in the late 17th century, is really the first to get a statue, and that's after the Civil War. In New England, it's a couple actually before Mary's is actually completely finished. In the antebellum period, you do get other women of the American Revolution remembered. Martha Washington, Elizabeth Rees Ellett, noted women's historian of the mid-19th century, publishes a multi-volume Women of the American Revolution of the heroines, mostly really celebrating them, their domestic lives, and the way they were helpmeets and supports and good patriots themselves that supported their husbands and their families. So the pantheon of revolutionary women that you would expect, I think that Mary is among them, and she opens the Elizabeth Rees Ellett's first volume, and she just has more possibilities because she's a mother, and a mother only. I mean, she was a wife, but a mother who never remarries, and the mother of Washington. So she is just rich with possibility in terms of thinking about, again, promoting a vision and version of motherhood, even though Martha was a mother too, but a wife. And so that's really her role in historical memory, Washington's wife.
Okay, so a couple of questions about sort of the book process, which I always find interesting. I hope you all do too, because I'm going to ask them either way. So when you were doing actually, let's start with, in your acknowledgments, you talked about your own mother and how this idea came to you. So what prompted this book project, and maybe the personal element of it as well?
Yeah, I mean, I'm an early Americanist and a women's gender historian and a cultural historian, and I was interested in tackling a biography in part. And then I was thinking about this, I'm trying to think about a new project as my own mother was sick and ultimately would die. And so I was thinking a lot about memory and about motherhood and memory within families, private memory, public memory. And so at first I thought about this as a history and memory. I thought I wanted to do a biography of Mary and an afterlife, what I call a biography that begins in death. And then an editor at the time said to me, this is years ago now, of course, said, that's 2 books. And that's really 2 books. And you're going to have to choose. And I was like, well, maybe we'll see. But then I learned, so I'm trying to think what year this was, that there were not 1, but 2 biographies, one excellent, very scholarly, of Mary Ball Washington underway. And in fact, they were published in 2019. Martha Saxton's and Craig Shirley's. And I thought, okay, this seems like a sign. And I had started working on the first monument, the early monument. I had started my research down in Richmond at Virginia, it's not Virginia Historical Society anymore, Virginia Museum of History and Culture. And so I thought, okay, I'll just pivot, and I really will. I'll do a little bit with her life, but I'll begin with her death. And this will be a book about her long afterlife.
When you were doing the research, can you share with us some surprises you found or sources that caught you off guard?
I mean, some of the stories I just found very amusing and kind of surprising. And, there were these 2, I talk about this in the book, these 2 portraits of her discovered in the 1880s. No, I mean, they're not, there's nothing from life of her, but they very elaborate, backstories about these and who created them, why. In my research at National Archives in College Park, there are 2 boxes of the files, the records of the National Mary Washington Memorial Association. And I don't know how much they had ever really been used, but so I spent a few days working in those. This was during COVID, so I remember having to make an appointment, and it was canceled, and then going back for an appointment. And in one of the first folders in the first box, I opened it up, and there was a wooden block with a glass overlay with this etching of the monument on it. And there was also, and this is in the book, an image of it, a beautiful badge of the National Mary Washington Memorial Association with a note saying it had belonged to the organization's first secretary, Margaretta Hetzel. And it was just lovely, this blue satin ribbon, very elaborate. And so I took a picture. And then I went up to ask, I said, if I wanted to have photography of this made, I want to use this in my book, how do I need to go about that? Of course, the National Archives, as most repositories, protocol, courtesy lines, all of that. And the guy goes, there's an object in the folder? And I was like, yes, in fact, there are 2 in the objects in the folders. And he was freaked out. And he went back and kind of got somebody, and they sort of, And they're like, they're not supposed to be objects in the folder. She's like, these are going to have to go. We're taking these. And I'm like, well, wait, I might need them again. So it was just this whole scandal that there are these objects in the records folder. So anyway, they went away. And who knows, they're now with the treasures or whatever. They totally different.
Get them back?
No, I didn't. I mean, so that was it. So I reached back out and I had a pretty good photograph of it. And I was like, can I just use my photograph? Who knows where this badge is now, right? It's somewhere, but it's not in that folder. I can tell you right now, it's not in that folder.
Just because it's somewhere, I digress, but this is, there are a lot of mysteries contained even in the very best of archives. And so, for example, when Washington was at the Constitutional Convention, at the very end of the convention, he wrote a cover letter basically endorsing the Constitution, giving it to Congress to send out for ratification. At some point, the cover letter and the Constitution, they were in the State Department. When Jefferson was Secretary of State, they eventually went to the archives once the archive was a thing. We know that that letter was there after World War II. They don't know where it is.
Lost it.
Survived the War of 1812, survived the Civil War, survived World War I, survived World War II.
Stolen.
Maybe it's in the ribbon container.
It's with them. It's with the treasure.
So yes, there are mysteries in the archives. I love that. That is such a cool
Also
discovery.
in the other box, there were, this was well beyond the chronological review of this book, but there were all of these records about the loss. There was a lawsuit between the two Mary Washington Memorial Associations in the 1960s about claiming them and tending to the monument and who was supposed to be doing that and not doing it. So that was the whole thing too. I was like, oh, that's a very rich story.
Very scandalous. Were there in the course of your research, were there any questions you couldn't answer?
Oh, well, it's interesting. Somebody asked me this the last time, and I kind of came up short. I was like, I would always sort of love to have had, even though it's about her and death and her memory, I always love to have more of her voice, more of her thoughts, especially as you think about these stories over time. But I think that what I think is that you maybe come in with ideas and questions, but then they change, right? So as you see what's there and what speaks to you in the records and the research you're working with, and then your questions change or your thinking evolves. So there wasn't one burning thing. I mean, would I love to know really what she thought about, and really why didn't you remarry? Why didn't you want to go into the Navy? Why, I mean, did your horse really die? Whatever. But yeah.
I know it's, but I do always like to ask that question because I think it's so important that we emphasize the silences, that there are things we can't answer, even if we really want to. Okay, there's some really fun questions in here, including some that really made me chuckle because I had not thought about them. Do we know how she felt about the revolution? How did she feel about Britain and Washington?
Another thing we do not know, and yet. So it's something that Parke Custis chooses to address head on. In his essay, he says, I want to address, I'm paraphrasing, but he says it very directly, the ludicrous, spurious idea that she favored the royal cause. So that was obviously out there as a rumor or something about her. I think that what we think is that maybe she wasn't the warmest of patriots, that she wasn't out there, she wasn't a proclaimed daughter of liberty or Affinities, but that maybe she just, especially at her age, disliked war. Her son was involved in war, he was exactly a pacifist, but that's what we can surmise. But no, we really don't know. But that was clearly floating around, right?
Yeah. He starts with that.
He doesn't start it, but it's in there. And it's like this kind of paragraph that's just very, and then he goes on to talk about her appearing with George at the Peace Ball, not a thing, but in Fredericksburg. There was some ball at some point, but it wasn't right after the war. And so she appeared on his arm, and everyone was so impressed because she was so simple in her dress and a dress. That's a big thing about her in the 19th century. Simple, sort of retiring. Not ostentatious, not overly impressed with pomp and circumstance, even when it came to her son.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Barb, thank you very much for that question. It was an excellent one. Another sort of question about how the 19th century writers thought about her or talked about her comes from Ike, which is, He wants to know how they talked about her involvement in slavery. Did they talk about it, or did they
That's a
completely
great
ignore it?
question. By the late 19th century, yes. Earlier in the 19th century, no. There's no mention really of her as an enslaver whatsoever. And the writers about her really ran the gamut in their positions, from the very pro-slavery James Kirk Paulding, who had a biography of Washington, pay a lot of attention to her in it, to the more anti-slavery Washington Irving, or kind of neutral. So, but no attention to that. By the 19th century, late 19th century, post-abolition, even post-Reconstruction, it becomes safer in a way to remember her as an enslaver, and she kind of evolves the Mother of Washington figure into a kind of a plantation mistress figure, good missus, kind mistress, and that's where you see slavery and some enslaved figures very much partaking of the plantation fiction genre in these renditions, accounts of Mary Washington, such as the one in the early 1890s that Mary Terhune writes to help fund the monument cause. That the book sales of the life of Mary Washington will help fund the monument cause.
That's interesting that it's used in, like, very explicitly in that way. Okay, so Kathleen would like to know, she said the image on the front of the book, which you all can see here, is chock full of symbols and material culture. That it is. Can you say where you found it and kind of give us a little sense of what we should be seeing when we look at this cover?
It's a mid-19th century, I think the date is imprecise, but about circa 1860, so right on the eve of the American Civil War, of what many call, this is another canonical story, the last interview, where he goes to see her right before assuming the presidency, and she bestows on him her blessing, and by the blessings of God. And it's almost like she has to die, and she's about to die so that he can live. There's a lot of, savior figure, save the nation. This is just such a bizarre, very creepy. I mean, she's her eyes heavenward. I mean, she's about to be taken up, and he's kneeling, but he looks pretty old too. And then you have, a domestic, comfortable but not fine interior, and then the shadowy domestic, either servant or enslaved woman in the back, kind of looking in and witnessing this private moment sort of made public, and just, I think, really pregnant with a lot of meaning. And you see her on the spectacles, on the desk, and her Bible. Her Bible becomes very important and her devotional literature. Matthew Hale's Contemplations, very important in the hands of 19th century writers.
Couple questions about that. So are those spinning needles down the bottom? Is that like a spinning basket?
Yeah,
okay.
basket.
So I want to circle back to that in terms of like Republican motherhood, but doesn't she kind of look like she's supposed to be blind? Why would she have spectacles?
I think her eyes are heavenward. I don't think she's supposed to be blind. I think it's just like she's just receiving the power, and then through it passing through her to her son.
Yeah.
That's my read.
Interesting. So is it common in imagery of women, especially in the 19th century, to feature the sort of domestic labor of knitting or sewing?
Absolutely.
Like
I think of the image that comes immediately to mind are the ones of Sojourner Truth that she produces, where the cards that she sells, and I sell the shadow to support the substance, and she's always in a very domestic, and sometimes with something in her lap, and I think you're absolutely right. It's a really powerful, and especially for an enslaved woman, of womanhood, of motherhood, of domesticity.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Okay, so Bianca would like to know how we can use the life of Mary Washington and women of her era to help us better understand and study the Revolution.
Oh, well, I mean, gosh, women were very much a part of the American Revolution, women of all backgrounds, and Mary is just one. She's less of a way in some ways than others because she's older and not as involved, right? We have other women of the Revolutionary era. I mean, Abigail Adams, some very well known, others less well known, who were either active patriots or loyalists, and we have more sources from them. But this, as a field of study and as a way in, it's not, okay, on the one hand, it's not super recent because I talked about Elizabeth Elliot, right, in her mid-19th century compendia. But within professional historical conversations, some of this dates to the 80s, 70s, and 80s, this recovery of women's experiences of during the American Revolution. Again, their own voices, what we have, their own terms.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Speaking of their own voices, Heather would like to know, do we have anything on Mary and Martha? Do we know, like, did Martha say anything ever about Mary?
We don't have a lot from Martha either. And for the last time I was doing a talk here, it was for the Martha Washington papers. And it's mostly about her, not her.
Yeah.
So, but it's fascinating because often from that first joint biography of Mary's, Margaret Cogburn Conkling, it's joint Mary and Martha, the women in his life kind of thing, wife and mother. Benson Lossing, late 19th century, Mary and Martha. So they're often paired, right, in historical memory and in these portrayals, this discursive way. But in terms of no, we really don't know anything about much. I mean, I really don't know.
Fly on the wall for that. Do we know if they ever even met?
Nancy, that's a great question. I don't know.
Research. Okay, if there are any students watching, research paper.
That's got to be in Martha. That's got to be in Martha Saxon's
we're going to do a
somewhere.
call to the audience.
That's
Yes,
gotta
sir.
They met at least one time. I can't remember the year, but Martha took George and John Parke Custis, I believe it was, to Perry Pond. So there's at least one time that they met.
Okay.
Interesting. Okay, so for those watching and listening at home, we did a an audience lifeline, and it seems that there was indeed one meeting at Perry Park.
But I would be interested to. Yeah. All right.
That's such an interesting question. I'm sorry to ask questions that we did not plan on, but it came up and I was like, oh,
It
yeah, I gotta
happens.
know.
In conversation.
That's so fascinating. Okay, so Amanda would like to know, what are your thoughts on how Mary is meaningful to different public audiences today? What would you hope, if you were talking to school children, what would you want them to learn about her?
I mean, I think that I would want them to know that, that we don't know a whole lot about her, right? We know that she's the mother of Washington. Here's what we do know, and I would offer the things that I offered in that first, the life in a nutshell thing. But I would also want to say, but there was a lot written about her over time. She became a really important figure for these reasons. So it's not that she wasn't important. She was, and usually by virtue or in proximity to her much more famous son. So I would share what we do know about her and her life. And again, I think there's some good biography with scant material out there. But I would want them, I guess I would steer them a little bit to the history. But I would also say, but if you want to know more about of the Revolutionary era, there are other figures too. Judge,
Yeah. So you've talked a little bit about how, her role as a mother was discussed and kind of presented as this ideal mother in the 19th century. Do we have any sources that suggest, or any knowledge about whether or not she was used in particular to discuss other mothers of presidents? Or do people ever refer to her as the ideal mother of a president? Was that part of the story, or was anyone calling
No,
to that?
Mother of Washington, because he's
Okay.
so famous as a president, but also a general, also revolution. I mean, he's so beyond, right? I mean, at one point, I remember somebody saying, when did you first figure out that Washington had a mother? Right? Because he's such this kind of larger than life, mythological figure. We think, of him as Athena sprung from the head of Zeus or something, in full military regalia. But no, that's not. It's so much about her and him. But her as a model, as an exemplar for all women.
Okay. Yeah, not just
for all
mothers of
women.
presidents.
Yeah.
Interesting.
How to mother, how to raise a George.
Okay, so Mary wants to know, and this is sort of transition to sort of the last, what you might be working on next, but she wants to know if there was another historical figure with a very complicated cultural memory that you might be interested in researching in the future.
Well, not really. I mean, I hadn't really thought of this as another, as I would continue in this direction. I'm sure there are many. I mean, in fact, there are some, life and afterlife. I'm trying to think of some good projects that I've come across like that. Nell Painter's, I was thinking, because we talked about Sojourner Truth, she had a book on her and sort of history and memory. My own, but I did get to this through this project because so much of this is about Virginia. Mary, George, the Washingtons, and Virginians, kind of, especially the French were people trying to lay claim to the national story, right? And it sometimes in competition with Massachusetts or New England, right? So it starts in the 19th century, like the battle for American history. So I got very interested in thinking about Virginia history and the creation of Virginia history before the creation of the Virginia Historical Society in 1831, so that the early Virginia history in various forms and how sort of, in my mind, it's called creating the Old Dominion, and different people writing and maybe even through material culture too, thinking about the forms Virginia history takes early on. So that's what I'm thinking about. But I'm also thinking about a project on, I just to be really honest, about motherhood as a political platform, like groups of women engaging the state through motherhood, from the beloved mothers of the Cherokee Nation through kind of Mothers Against Drunk Driving, or Moms Demand Action is the gun control group, I think, today. So I've been thinking about that too.
Yes, absolutely.
Two very different projects.
Very different projects. It's good to have lots of different ideas, and certainly we know a place where you would want to do some research if you end up doing the Virginia project. So either way, we will be back again at some point. So if you could all join me in thanking Dr. Kate Haulman. Her book is available for sale out there. Will sign it, and I will give my plea to always support your small local business, including Mount Vernon, with your book sales. And thank you all so much for being here. Thank you for your questions, and thank you to Kate.
Thank you. Thank you.
We hope we will see you all again soon, and safe drive, and have a lovely night.